Before the world knew his name, before he became a tragic footnote in nuclear history, Cecil Kelley was simply a man trying to build an honest life. He was not a scientist, not a physicist, not someone chasing glory inside the secret world of atomic research. He was a technician, quiet, punctual, dependable. The kind of worker everyone trusted but few truly noticed. Yet destiny had marked him for a fate so rare, so violent, so unseen that even the nuclear pioneers of his time had no words for what would happen to him. Born into a humble family in New Mexico, Cecil grew up in the shadow of the American desert, a place where silence stretches for miles and people learn to endure whatever life brings. His father was a mechanic, his mother a homemaker. They raised their son with values that would later define him: discipline, respect, and a stubborn kind of patience. He wasn't brilliant in school, neither was he average. He was steady, reliable, the kind of young man who listened more than he spoke. When the atomic age dawned after World War II, job opportunities boomed in places tied to nuclear research. Men like Cecil saw it as a chance to escape poverty, not for fame, not for scientific curiosity. Just a stable paycheck, a chance to support a family, a promise of a better future. By the 1950s, he was working at the famous and infamous Los Alamos-operated Wood River Junction facility in Idaho. This was no ordinary workplace. The Cold War was at its peak, and secrecy was not just a rule, it was a religion. Buildings had no windows, hallways echoed with whispers, and every worker understood that something powerful, something dangerous, was always happening behind those metal doors. Yet Cecil adapted. Supervisors liked him because he never caused trouble. Co-workers admired him because he stayed calm during emergencies, even minor accidents. To them, he was the man who could fix a faulty valve at 3 a.m. without complaining. The man who didn't panic when alarms rang, the man who kept everyone grounded. He was married, a father, a provider, a man with simple dreams. Family dinners, a little house, a stable life in a world where nations were racing to build weapons that could erase cities in seconds. But inside Wood River, his job carried a silent threat, one he didn't fully understand and one no one bothered to explain. Every day, he worked near mixtures of plutonium waste, swirling them, monitoring them, trusting that the instructions he received were accurate and safe. No one told him how unstable those materials could become. No one warned him about the invisible line between routine and catastrophe. Employees at the facility joked that they worked one floor above hell. Radiation, chemical exposure, unknown experiments, it was part of the job. But Cecil wasn't a man who questioned orders. He believed that if there was danger, someone would tell him. Someone would stop him. Someone would protect him. He had no idea that the system designed to keep him safe was quietly failing him. He had no idea that one ordinary winter morning would turn him into something unimaginable. He would soon become the most radioactive man in human history, not because he made a mistake, but because others did. In 1958, the Wood River facility stood alone in the cold emptiness of Idaho's desert, an isolated outpost where silence felt heavier than the winter air itself. There were no crowds, no curious eyes, no journalists peeking through fences, only endless miles of barren land, and a building designed to hide more than it revealed. It was the kind of place where the world's most dangerous work was done by men who were never allowed to speak about it. This was a Los Alamos-controlled processing site, responsible for handling nuclear waste and extracting plutonium from leftover materials. A place where the smallest mistake was buried under paperwork and silence, and where even the truth was classified. The men who worked here didn't know the full scale of the danger around them. They weren't trained to ask questions. They weren't encouraged to understand the physics or the risks. They were there to follow instructions that were often incomplete, outdated, or dangerously wrong. Inside this steel and concrete fortress, Cecil Kelley reported for duty every morning. He wore the same white uniform, punched the same time clock, and walked the same dim hallways that echoed with the hum of machinery. To an outsider, his job might have seemed technical, even prestigious. But for him, it was routine, a rhythm he had mastered over the years. His main responsibility was deceptively simple: operate a huge stainless steel mixing tank full of liquid waste containing trace amounts of plutonium. The waste was stirred, processed, and eventually shipped for disposal or further refinement. On the surface, it was just another industrial task, like mixing chemicals in a giant vat. But beneath that calm routine, something far more dangerous lurked. The tank was designed to be safe as long as the concentration of plutonium remained low. As long as the mixture stayed uniform. As long as someone upstream didn't accidentally send a too rich batch of material into it. As long as every step of the system worked exactly as planned. But this was the 1950s, a time when nuclear safety was based more on confidence than on science. Paperwork could be wrong. Measurements could be skipped. Assumptions could be deadly. The men running the facility often worked with outdated equipment. They relied on verbal reports, on handwritten labels, on memory. No sensors warned them if plutonium levels climbed too high. No alarms told them the tank was becoming unstable. No automated systems existed to prevent a dangerous buildup. The truth was brutal. The tank could turn into a nuclear reactor if the mixture ever reached a critical mass. And that possibility, that silent threat, was growing inside the waste day after day, unnoticed by everyone, including Kelley. He believed the tank was safe. He believed the system was reliable. He believed someone, somewhere, was tracking the chemistry correctly. But something had changed. Somewhere in the long chain of processing, plutonium levels had risen far beyond what anyone expected. Dense crystals were settling at the bottom, forming a deadly pocket of material. A hidden danger no one saw, no one measured, and no one warned him about. Every time Kelley climbed the metal stairs to check the tank, he stood just inches away from a potential nuclear flash. A flash bright enough to blind a room. A flash powerful enough to kill a man without touching him. A flash born not from an explosion, but from atoms tearing themselves apart. Yet the building remained quiet, indifferent, watching him walk toward his fate. No alarms. No signs. No whispered warnings. Just a man doing his job. And a tank waiting for one wrong movement to awaken the storm inside it. December 28th, 1958. The morning began like any other. A dull, gray winter day where the cold crept through steel walls and settled into the bones of every man on duty. The Wood River facility hummed softly, its machinery breathing in slow mechanical rhythms. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing hinted at the catastrophe that was minutes away. Inside the processing building, Cecil Kelley prepared for another routine shift. He wasn't thinking about danger. He wasn't worried. He had performed this task hundreds of times, checking the mixing tank, stirring the liquid waste, making sure everything looked normal. It was the kind of job a man could do half asleep. And on a cold December morning, most workers were still waking up. What Kelley didn't know, what no one told him, was that the latest batch of waste sent into the tank was dangerously overloaded with plutonium. The concentration was far beyond anything the system could safely handle. But the paperwork was wrong. The measurements were wrong. And the supervisors assumed everything was normal. That assumption would nearly kill everyone in the building. Cecil walked across the metal platform, his footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The tank stood in the center like a giant silent beast. He climbed the steel ladder, gripping the cold railing as frost bit into his fingers. At the top, he leaned over the open hatch. A faint chemical smell drifted upward. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. He picked up the long stirring pole, lowered it into the tank, and began his routine swirl. For a moment, everything was still. Then something happened. Something that had never happened before. The surface of the liquid didn't move the way it always did. Instead of spreading outward, the contents began to spin inward, sucked toward the center. The tank formed a vortex, a deep whirlpool twisting violently as if something buried at the bottom had suddenly awakened. Kelley froze. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Something was horribly, impossibly wrong. Before he could react, before he could shout, before he could take a single step back, a blinding blue-white flash erupted from the tank. It was instant. It was violent. And it was unlike anything anyone in that building had ever seen. A sphere of brilliant light shot upward, filling the room with a ghostly blue glow. The unmistakable signature of a nuclear criticality. Not a bomb, not an explosion, but a runaway chain reaction where atoms split uncontrollably. unleashing a burst of pure radiation. The flash was silent. No flames, no smoke, no warning. Just the raw, terrifying light of atoms tearing themselves apart. Witnesses later said it looked like the sun had risen inside the tank. The flash hit Kelley like a physical blow. A surge of energy slammed into his body, throwing him backward off the ladder. His face burned. His clothes felt as if they were on fire. His skin prickled with 1,000 invisible needles. For a moment, the world around him dissolved into a haze of blue light. Then, the light vanished, as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the harsh hum of the machinery and the heavy breathing of a man who had just absorbed more radiation than any human in history. The other workers ran toward him, confused, panicked, shouting his name. But no one understood what they had just witnessed. To them, it was just a flash of light. To physicists, it was a nuclear nightmare. To Cecil Kelley, it was the moment his life ended, even though his heart still beat. He had become, in a single second, a living reactor, a man who had taken the full force of a criticality into his body. And the true horror had only just begun. The flash hurled Cecil Kelley backward as if an invisible force had struck him square in the chest. He hit the concrete floor with a dull, heavy thud, the metal ladder rattling above him. For a moment, he could neither breathe nor understand what had happened. His ears rang. His vision flickered white. His body trembled uncontrollably. Then the pain came. A burning, crushing, all-consuming pain. It felt as if fire had bloomed inside his bones, as if molten metal was flowing through his veins. His face stung with a deep, searing heat. His clothes were warm to the touch, smoldering from the radiant energy that had washed over him. His skin tingled, not on the surface, but deep underneath like a storm of needles swirling through every nerve. He struggled to sit up, but his limbs refused to obey. He tasted metal in his mouth. His head throbbed. Sweat broke across his forehead even though the room was freezing. The other workers rushed over, shouting his name, but Cecil barely heard them. He was fading in and out, his mind sinking into a fog he couldn't escape from. The world around him seemed brighter somehow, as if everything reflected a white-blue shimmer. Minutes later, medical staff arrived, a small emergency team trained for chemical spills, not nuclear catastrophes. What they saw left them speechless. One nurse later told investigators, "He looked like he was glowing from the inside, a furnace under the skin." His entire body radiated an unnatural pallor, pale, almost luminescent. His face was flushed red, as if scorched by invisible fire. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. His skin gleamed with an eerie sheen, a look no human should ever have. His hair appeared slightly singed. His pulse raced out of control. They didn't know it yet, but the glow wasn't real light. It was the acute radiation cascade wreaking havoc inside him. His cells breaking apart, his blood chemistry collapsing, his DNA unraveling by the second. Cecil tried to speak, but the words came out broken, slurred. Something happened. The light. He didn't know he had just survived a nuclear event more concentrated than Hiroshima. He didn't know his entire body had absorbed a dose of radiation beyond the limits of science. He didn't know he had become the most irradiated human being in recorded history. When doctors examined him, the seriousness of the situation snapped into brutal focus. This wasn't a burn. This wasn't chemical exposure. This was something far worse. Something catastrophic. Their instruments didn't need exact numbers. The symptoms spoke for themselves. Within minutes, they realized this was unlike anything they had ever seen. He had taken more radiation than Hiroshima survivors received at Ground Zero. More than Chernobyl firefighters who died within hours. More than any nuclear worker, scientist, or soldier in history. Cecil Kelley had, in the blink of an eye, absorbed a lethal dose so massive that his survival was not possible. Not for days, not for hours, not even in theory. His body was deteriorating faster than any medicine could repair. Inside him, millions of cells had been obliterated instantly. His bone marrow was collapsing. His blood vessels were beginning to leak. His gastrointestinal system was dying. His central nervous system had been blasted with energy beyond measurement. While the building around him returned to silence, inside his body a war raged, a war he could not win. The nurses carried him out on a stretcher, unaware that they were watching a man whose life had already ended in the moment of the flash. even though his heart was still beating. The first hours after the flash were a descent into a kind of suffering no human body was designed to endure. Doctors rushed Cecil Kelley into an isolation room, still unsure how much radiation he had absorbed. But they could already see the telltale signs. The trembling hands, the flushed skin, the rapid pulse. They suspected a criticality accident, but none of them imagined the scale of exposure he had taken. None of them yet understood that they were witnessing the highest internal plutonium dose ever recorded in a human being. Within the first hour, the collapse began. At a microscopic level, his blood was the first to fall apart. Red and white cells ruptured almost instantly, as though thousands of tiny explosions were going off inside his veins. His platelet count plunged. Even his bone marrow, the factory of human life, had been burned by the invisible fire. The doctors watched in horror as his blood chemistry changed right before their eyes. His skin began to lose its color. The healthy tan he'd earned from years in the desert sun drained away, replaced by a sickly gray tone that spread across his face and chest. Blotches appeared, dark patches, bruises forming without impact, stains rising from the breakdown of blood vessels beneath the surface. It happened too fast. Too violently. Too completely. Then came the vomiting. Violent, unstoppable, a classic sign of massive radiation poisoning. His body was desperately trying to purge what it could never remove. Nurses held his shoulders as wave after wave shook his entire frame. He gasped for breath. He whispered apologies between heaves. At one point, he asked if he was dying. They couldn't answer. His temperature skyrocketed. Sweat poured down his forehead. His skin felt both feverish and ice cold. His heart pounded as if trying to outrun the damage inside him. Then the deeper symptoms began. His internal organs, the liver, the stomach lining, the intestines, started breaking down. Radiation doesn't bruise or burn the surface. It destroys life from the inside out. Cells multiplied uncontrollably, then collapsed. Enzymes malfunctioned, veins leaked. Entire biological systems began shutting down. But the most horrifying part? He was awake for all of it. Unlike many radiation victims who lose consciousness quickly, Cecil remained fully aware for hours. He felt the unraveling of his own body. He felt the boiling heat inside his bones. He felt the slow collapse of systems he could not control. He grabbed the doctor's wrist at one point, eyes wide, voice shaking. It felt like the world exploded inside me. Those were his words. The only way he could describe the flash, the pain, the terror of a nuclear event blooming inside his body. Scientists stood around his bed taking frantic notes, their faces pale. They had studied radiation in textbooks. They had calculated safe limits. They had run simulations in laboratories, but they had never seen anything like this. One wrote in his report, a sentence that later became infamous. "This is the highest internal plutonium absorption ever seen in a human being. Not a soldier, not a bomb victim, not a scientist from Manhattan Project experiments, not even the dying firefighters of Chernobyl. Cecil Kelley's exposure surpassed them all. And yet, through every minute of agony, he remained aware, speaking, trembling, crying, asking questions no one could answer. His body was being dismantled cell by cell. His organs were dissolving. His blood was evaporating into toxicity. And he was forced to feel every second of it. The doctors knew the truth but couldn't say it aloud. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for time. Time to understand what had happened. Time to speak. Time to exist for just a few more hours before the inevitable end. He had already received a death sentence from the atomic age. And now, he was living through every moment of that sentence in slow, agonizing detail. Cecil Kelley had always been quiet, a man whose presence was measured, gentle, almost invisible in the daily chaos of the laboratory. Yet now, in the sterile, humming silence of the emergency ward, every monitor, every beep, and every flicker of fluorescent light seemed to mark the final chapters of his life. He knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that his time was slipping away. The radiation that had silently invaded his body was relentless, patient, and unforgiving. Kelley's once steady hands trembled with the effort of a body in rebellion against itself, and yet his mind remained sharp, painfully aware of each passing moment. At some point, he summoned the nurse, his voice barely more than a whisper, fragile against the backdrop of the clinical machinery surrounding him. "Don't let my family see me like this," he pleaded. There was a profound dignity in that request, a desire to shield the people he loved from the grotesque reality of what had been done to his body, to preserve their memory of him as he had always been, calm, kind, composed. For 35 grueling hours, Kelley's body waged a battle it could not win. Every breath was a struggle. Every heartbeat was a fading echo of a life that had once been full of laughter, curiosity, and quiet devotion to his work. Machines beeped, alarms pulsed, and doctors hovered, but the invisible enemy within him advanced steadily, patiently, erasing the very essence of life. And then, in the dead hours of the night, as the world outside slept unaware of the tragedy unfolding within the hospital walls, his heart surrendered. Slowly, imperceptibly, it gave up the fight. At 3 a.m., Cecil Kelley, the quiet, gentle technician who had touched countless lives with his skill and kindness, passed away. A life defined not by noise or spectacle, but by humility and dedication, ended in the cold, clinical embrace of inevitability. The world would continue, indifferent and unknowing, but the laboratory and those who had worked beside him would remember. Kelley's final hours were a silent testament to the invisible dangers that lurk in places we often take for granted. A stark reminder that even the smallest, most gentle lives are vulnerable to forces beyond comprehension. Death did not free Cecil Kelley from the invisible enemy that had claimed him. Even in death, his body remained a vessel of danger, a silent weapon of radiation, unpredictable and merciless. The quiet, gentle technician who had once handled delicate instruments with care was now untouchable, a corpse too hazardous to approach without armor. Doctors and nurses who had worked beside him stared in disbelief. To deal with him, they needed full, lead-lined suits that made every movement cumbersome. They wore double layers of gloves, their hands awkwardly navigating the sterile tools that could barely shield them from the invisible poison. Every action, every attempt to clean, examine, or move him was measured, calculated, and executed with a precision normally reserved for handling nuclear material. There were no ordinary procedures here. There were no familiar comforts, no humane gestures to soften the cruelty of death. Kelley's body had become something else entirely, a hazardous object, a reminder that the invisible dangers he had faced in life did not vanish with the final heartbeat. And in that eerie stillness, in the cold, controlled environment of the containment ward, the truth was undeniable. Cecil Kelley, even in death, had become radioactive. He was no longer just a man. He was a danger, a warning, a living, and now lifeless, embodiment of the silent, patient force that had claimed him. Because in the end, the thing that had destroyed him was not something you could see, not something you could touch, not even something you could mourn in a conventional way. His body had become what it had always been hiding inside. Nuclear, untouchable, deadly.
Cecil Kelley had done everything right. He followed procedures meticulously, respected every rule, every guideline, every warning. He was careful, methodical, precise, the kind of man who made the invisible forces of radiation seem manageable, almost predictable. And yet it was not Kelley who failed. It was the system, the bureaucracy. The invisible safety nets that were supposed to protect him had holes, and the warnings, clear, urgent, necessary, were never given. The risks, the silent, patient threat that he had unknowingly carried, were never monitored, never controlled. One ordinary man, a quiet technician who had spent his life in service to science, became something extraordinary and terrifying, the most radioactive human in history. His body, once merely human, had become a walking testament to the failures of those entrusted with safety. The Wood River accident shocked the scientific world. It forced a reckoning, a rewriting of rules, regulations, and protocols. Nuclear safety would never be the same. Lessons were learned. Systems were overhauled. Lives would be detected in the future. But for Cecil Kelley, none of it mattered anymore. The changes came too late. The safeguards that could have saved him were implemented only after his death. He had paid the ultimate price so that the world might learn, so that others might survive where he could not. In the end, Kelley's story was not one of negligence or recklessness. It was a tragedy of timing, a cruel reminder that even the most careful and conscientious can fall victim to the gaps left by those meant to protect them. And the world, staring into the cold light of his sacrifice, could only mourn and vow to do better, long after it was too late for him.